Hello, today we'll be discussing sociological research. The goal of research is to answer questions. Sociological research attempts to answer a vast variety of questions about our social world. Questions such as how do social movements such as Black Lives Matter develop? What impact does text messaging have on a teenager's ability to spell and write complete sentences in an English course? What are the factors that contribute to an individual becoming obsessed with a public figure? In reality, research questions seek to provide in-depth knowledge about a variety of topics. We all have our own opinions about different social phenomena and social situations. And at times we may carry with us some level of bias or some sort of expectation based on very limited life experience or very limited data. Scientific research seeks to combat that by providing empirical evidence that comes directly from the experience, that is scientifically gathered, and may at times be gathered through an experimentation. The idea of scientific research is in many ways to add validity, to add a deeper understanding of general topics that we may have in everyday life. We look at the concept of a meta-analysis. And meta-analysis is a technique in which the results of virtually all previous studies on a specific subject are evaluated together. So, for example, I might be interested in understanding why some students graduate from high school and others don't. I might want to look at factors such as campus environments, academic counseling, the quality of teacher instruction, and so on and so forth. So what I'm able to then do is to go into a research database that's offered by my local college or university that I'm attending, and I'm able to type in some keywords and begin to gather information that will allow me to do, in many ways, a cross-analysis, a cross-evaluation of any existing research that may exist, and then be able to reference those studies in any type of research I plan to approach. When we think, for example, about a meta-analysis, it challenges any prior narratives or any prior prejudices at times that we may hold. For example, we may assume that crime rates go up when we have a full moon. Well, that might be a coincidence. There may be some level of correlation, but in many ways, we could argue that research may not necessarily always support this opinion. As I mentioned before, it might just be a coincidence. We look at research done by Rod and Callie in 1985 via a meta-analysis. And they wanted to look at the full moon's effect on behavior. And so they reviewed over 37 previous or prior studies on the effects of the full moon on crime rates. And they concluded, after this extensive research, that full moons are not entirely unrelated to crime, suicide, psychiatric problems, and crisis center calls. That the occurrence of crime during a full moon is indeed that of a coincidence. Now, at times this may appear to be common sense to some of us, but through scientific research, we're able to confirm the truth about whatever topic we're trying to discover more about. Through sociological research, people attempt to understand the happenings in the social world by finding or creating an explanation for an occurrence. And we often develop a hypothesis for the same reason. For those of us who have taken some type of science course before, we're probably familiar with the term hypothesis. Because a hypothesis is a testable, educated guess about the predicted outcomes between two or more variables. It serves as a possible explanation for scientific happenings in the social world and allows for testing to determine whether the explanation holds true, in many instances, as well as among various groups or in different places. As sociologists, we use empirical data and the scientific method, or at times we could frame it as an interpretative framework to increase our understanding of societies and social interactions. But in reality, research begins with the search for an answer to a question. Think about the scientific method if you have experience with it in a previous course. The scientific method is a scientific process of research establishing parameters that help make sure the results are objective and accurate. Well, what does objective mean? Objective essentially states that we are free of prejudice, that we set aside any preconceived notions that we may have about outcomes or the causes of certain issues or problems, and we allow the data to speak for itself. And whether or not that data complements or challenges our conclusions, or our hypothesis, I should say, we're going to report the data accurately. We're not going to manipulate the data in any way, and we'll address that a little later. The scientific method provides limitations and boundaries that focus the study and organize its results. Typically, what happens when you engage in any level of sociological or scientific research is that you're going to have a very broad topic. And you're going to find through your readings of academic articles and you're conducting of research that you're going to need to take a very broad topic and make it a bit more specific. Not too specific where data is not available or past studies are not available, but just specific enough so that your research is focused. The scientific method also involves developing and testing theories about the social world that are based on empirical evidence. When we think about the scientific method, think about how it's defined. And it's defined as a commitment to systematic observation of the empirical world. And as we mentioned before, strives to be objective, critical, skeptical, and logical. Critical means that we are going to use our critical thinking skills. It's not that we're being critical in a negative way, but instead, we're asking why and how. We're skeptical in the sense that we do have our own prejudices. We do have our own preconceived notions of how things occur. We have to second guess at times data that's been published or the data that we're receiving to ensure that what is being said is truly accurate. What is being said truly paints a picture of what the social world is from an empirical perspective. When you look at the steps of the scientific method, you look at 6 key steps. You ask a question, you research existing sources, you formulate a hypothesis, you design and conduct a study, you draw conclusions, and then you report your results. So asking a question, well, this is the very first step. And so we ask a research question. We describe a problem. We identify a specific area of interest. When I wrote my dissertation at USC, I wanted to understand what were some of those barriers that students faced that impacted their ability to go from a high school environment to a post-secondary school environment. And so I framed my study in a manner that asked the question, what are the factors that impact student matriculation to post-secondary institutions? That provided me a narrow enough topic where I could zoom in many ways to the existing research on the effects of counseling, the effects of a college-going culture, getting students excited and exposed to colleges and universities. What type of environments were students raised in? Were they raised in environments that promoted post-secondary matriculation and achievement? Or were they told and encouraged to graduate from high school, go straight to work? These were some of the ideas that I had that shaped my research question. We want to understand that our topics can't be too specific where they don't achieve what we call universal merit. We want to make sure that other people can use our studies, that other people can refer to our studies as they're conducting their own research or trying to develop an understanding of an issue or a problem. As social science researchers, we must carefully define the terms we use in a research question. So when we develop these research questions, and we'll call them basic research questions, we need to develop an operational definition. Essentially, we need to define the concept in terms of the physical and concrete steps it takes to objectively measure it. The operational definition identifies an observable condition of the concept. And by operationalizing a variable of the concept, all researchers can collect data in a systematic and replicable manner. Our operational definitions must be valid, they must be appropriate, and they must be meaningful. We must have a reliable operational definition, meaning that our results will be close to unfirm when tested on more than one person. Think about this. Good drivers might be defined in the following ways. Those who use a turn signal, those who don't speed, those who courteously allow others to merge. And these type of behaviors can be interpreted differently by different researchers and can be in many ways pretty difficult to measure. Well, when you think about that, you want to make sure that our understanding of operational definitions are as universal as they possibly can be, that we can define what it is that we're trying to find, how it is that we're trying to define a particular word. You think about this concept of a driver who has never received a traffic violation. That's far more descriptive. That's far more specific in nature. So when we think about a good driver, just saying someone who uses the turn signals, well, that's too broad. Someone who doesn't speed, that's too broad. But someone who hasn't received a traffic violation, well, many researchers can get behind that. And they can say, okay, now I understand what we're trying to achieve here. Now I'm beginning to understand how we're going to define what is occurring in our social world, or in this case, the behaviors of drivers. We look at existing sources, and existing sources are, once again, sources of research that other individuals have provided. And we typically use library resources or some type of research database to collect these academic articles. And we conduct what we call a literature review. And we're going to read through mountains and mountains and mountains of documents. And we're trying to get such an in-depth understanding of the topic to see if A, our research question makes sense, and B, what is the data saying, or what is the research saying about our research question? By doing these literature reviews, not only are we checking to see how relevant is my topic, how much information is available about my topic, we're also beginning to refine, to improve the design of our study. We have to make sure we properly cite our sources that inform our studies, that we properly reference them so that we can avoid any level of plagiarism. And then we form our hypothesis. And it's an assumption about how two or more variables are related. What is the relationship that exists between these two variables? We might want to understand, for example, in sociology, how a hypothesis will oftentimes predict how one form of human behavior can influence another. And so we think about research and we look at it from the perspective of independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are the cause of change. Dependent variables are the effect. So let's take the example of a strategic college readiness program. I implement additional advising. I implement a mentorship program. I introduce a college fair. I introduce college tours. Those are the independent variables. Those are the things I am introducing to spark some level of change. The dependent variable being the effect, or the thing that is changed, would be the matriculation rates of students to post-secondary institutions. How many students are actually engaged in these programs? Have GPAs, have SAT scores or ACT scores improved? What is the self-efficacy, the self-confidence of students in reference to their belief that they too can go to a college or university? We think about basic studies. And I'm going to give us another example of how human behavior can be assessed in many ways through a research study. And we're going to look again at the concept of an independent and a dependent variable. Let's give you an example here. How does gender, the independent variable, affect the rate of income, the dependent variable? How is social class, the dependent variable, affected by an individual's level of education? So, in other words, the independent variable causes the effect. The dependent variable is the result of the effect. We want to make sure that we comprehend the idea that just because a sociologist forms an educated prediction of a study's outcome, it doesn't necessarily mean that the data is going to be consistent with what the hypothesis is assuming. And as sociologists, we analyze general patterns in response to a study. And we are equally interested in the exceptions to those patterns. Think about this. In a study of education, a researcher might predict that high school dropouts have a hard time finding rewarding careers. Well, it has become at least a cultural assumption that the higher the education, the higher the salary, and the higher the degree of career happiness. But there's certainly exceptions to the rules. People with little education at times can have stunning careers. And people with advanced degrees can can experience trouble finding work. As sociologists, we know our hypothesis and the results of our hypothesis or of our study can vary, and we have to be prepared for that. We look at the interpretive framework, which we made a little bit of a reference to early on in this presentation. While many sociologists rely on the scientific method as a research approach, others operate from an interpretive framework. While systematic, this approach does not follow the hypothesis testing model that seeks to find generalizable results. Instead, an interpretive framework, sometimes referred to as an interpretive perspective, seeks to understand social worlds from the point of view of participants, which leads to in-depth knowledge. So in other words, interpretive frameworks are more descriptive and narrative in their findings. Rather than formulating a hypothesis and a method for testing it, an interpretive researcher will develop approaches to explore the topic at hand that may involve a significant amount of direct observation and interactions with subjects. This type of research allows a researcher to learn as he or she proceeds, and if need be, make adjustments to the research methods or the processes midway to optimize findings as they evolve. In interpretive frameworks, You want to find the value in observations, as we mentioned, the value in interactions with subjects. If you are able to develop a strong rapport, if you have the trust of the individuals that you are studying, it can identify new concepts, new data that you perhaps didn't imagine before. Sociological topics are not reduced to right or wrong facts. In the field of sociology, results of studies tend to provide people with access to knowledge that they didn't have before. Knowledge of other cultures, knowledge of rituals and beliefs, knowledge of trends and attitudes. No matter what research approach a researcher adopts, it's important that the researcher maximize the study's reliability, which refers to how likely research results are to be replicated if the study is reproduced. In other words, in my research or in my research paper or academic article, I have to be able to lay out all of the steps that I've adopted in order to conduct my research. And I have to develop and provide that information in a clear and definitive manner, so that if person A and person B want to replicate my study, they have the ability to do so, with the assumption that the results will be very similar. Something that is able to be replicated, something that is reliable in nature, adds integrity, strengthens the quality of the research that we're conducting. In addition to that, researchers also strive for validity. And validity refers to how well the study measures what it was designed to measure, right? If I want to measure high school dropout rates, if I want to measure the impact of a strategic college readiness program on student graduation and student matriculation to post-secondary institutions, I have to ensure that at the end of the day, my study is able to achieve that, whether or not it's consistent with what my hypothesis and the assumptions of my hypothesis were trying to say. We understand that sociologists can use the scientific method not only to collect, but also to interpret and analyze data. Sociologists deliberately apply scientific logic and objectivity. They're interested in, but not attached to, the results. They oftentimes work outside of social and political agendas. In other words, they rid themselves of undue bias. They rid themselves of influence from outsiders or individuals who have some type of benefit from a study going in a particular direction, and they remain objective. Now, we obviously have our own personalities. We obviously have our own preferences and opinions. But in order to have a consistent study, we have to remain objective. We have to remain focused. With its scientific approach, the scientific method has proven useful in shaping sociological studies. The scientific methods provides a systematic, organized series of steps that help ensure objectivity and consistency in exploring a social problem. They provide the means for accuracy, reliability, and validity. And in the end, the scientific method provides a shared basis for discussion and analysis. Sociologists examine the world. They see a problem or an interesting pattern, and they set out to study it. They use research methods to design a study, such as a detailed systematic scientific method for conducting research and obtaining data, or an ethnographic study utilizing an interpretive frameworks. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Planning the research design is a key step in any sociological study. When entering a particular social environment, a researcher has to be careful. At times, they may have to remain anonymous, and other times they can be very, very overt or intentional about what they're studying. They can clearly communicate that to individuals who are participating, or individuals that they may be observing. At times, they may conduct interviews or observations or distribute surveys. Some participants need to be thoroughly informed, and others may not. We may not want to let them know that we're observing them because they begin to shape their behaviors at times to appear more favorable to us, to be more cautious about how they're being perceived. Well, you want to take that into consideration, that if people know they are being studied and they begin to change their behaviors to appear to be more favorable and acceptable, then it creates a very artificial observation. And we call that the Hawthorne effect, how people's behaviors are manipulated the minute that they know that they're being observed. All studies shape the research design. And while research design simultaneously shapes the study, researchers choose methods that best suit their study topics and that fit with their overall approaches to research. In planning a study design, sociologists generally choose from 4 widely used methods of social investigation: survey, field research, experiment, and secondary analysis, or the use of existing sources. Every research method comes with its strengths and its weaknesses, and the topic of the study strongly influences which method or methods are put to use. Surveys are a form of what we call quantitative research, numerical research. This idea that I can ask a question that is predetermined, the responses are predetermined, choose A, B, C, or D. Choose strongly agree to strongly disagree, and anywhere in between in a Likert scale. And when you think about surveys as a form of quantitative research, we're then able to say 70% of the students believe this, 50% of the students agree with this statement, 80% of the students believe that textbooks are too expensive for their community college courses. It provides us a very efficient, a very affordable way to collect data rapidly, to allow individuals to remain anonymous, and it gives a very basic general picture. We're not going to get in-depth responses from individuals typically on a survey. We ask them about a series of questions about their behaviors, about their opinions. We develop a questionnaire, right? It's the most widely used scientific research method because you got to think about it. The time, the resources you spend in creating a survey, then you're able to send out to 500, 1,000, 50,000 people. That information can be directly upon response to the questionnaire or the survey and put it into a database, a spreadsheet. And you're able to decipher people's responses to be able to draw the conclusion that 25% of people believe this, 40% of people believe that, 10% of people believe this. And the standard survey format allows individuals a level of anonymity, as we mentioned before. So hopefully they can find the statement that best reflects their personal ideas and beliefs. Sociologists conduct studies under controlled conditions for specific purposes. Surveys gather different types of information from people. As I mentioned before, surveys don't necessarily provide in-depth knowledge, and we know that. But they also serve as a great method for discovering how people feel and how people think, or at least how they say they feel and think. Surveys can help track preferences for presidential candidates, or reported individual behaviors, or factual information such as employment status, income, and educational levels. Surveys target specific populations. People who are the focus of studies such as college athletes, international students, or teenagers living with type 1 diabetes. Most researchers choose a survey to survey a small sector of the population, or what we call a sample, a manageable number of subjects who represent a larger population. The success of a study depends on how well a population is represented by the sample. We look at this concept of a random sample, and a random sample essentially says that everyone in the population that we're studying has an equal chance of being chosen for the survey or for the study. So if I have 1,000 students at Los Angeles Harbor College who I want to survey, first-generation students, students between the ages of 18, 20 to 24 years old, students who are enrolled on a full-time basis, students who are part of some type of equity program like Puente or APAS or Umoja. Well, when I do my study and I try to figure out who is it that I'm going to invite to participate in my study, I might say, well, of those 1,000 students, I realistically need 300 to participate. So I might send out 1,000 questionnaires saying, hey, would you like to participate in my study? And every student has that opportunity to say yes or no. And let's say of those 1,500 come back and say, absolutely, I want to participate. I can then send out that survey to all 500. But at the same time, let's say I only need 100 students of the 500 that responded. I could randomize all the names, possibly by ID number, on a spreadsheet. And I can say, I need 100 students out of a pool of 500 that have agreed to participate. Every 5 students on this randomized list will be selected to participate in the study. So I might go from number 5, number 10, number 15, number 20, number 25, all the way till I get to 500, which would then give me 100 participants. You do that so that you make sure that you're inclusive. You do that so that everyone feels like they're valued and that they had the opportunity to participate in the study. So after we select our subjects, the researcher develops a specific plan to ask questions and record responses. It's very important to inform subjects of the nature and the purpose of the study up front. If people know that they're participating in a study, you need to be very honest with them. I am collecting this data. I am conducting this survey. I am conducting this study for A, B, and C purposes. If people agree to participate, researchers must have the participants sign an informed consent form. Informed consent forms provide details about the research study, about the rights of the participants, and explains how the researcher will protect the confidentiality and the privacy of participants. That is very important. After signing an informed consent form, the researcher then presents the participant with an instrument, which is a means of gathering information. Once again, it may be a questionnaire that asks a series of questions. Researchers can ask yes or no, multiple choice questions. And as we mentioned before, this is a form of quantitative data. Now, you want to be cautious. You want to make sure you don't exhaust your participants by asking too many questions. You don't want to waste their time asking, oh, what's your age? What's your height? What's your ethnicity? What's your education level? You can get all that information from your initial invitation to them to see if they want to participate in the study. When we talk about quantitative research, just to reiterate, it's research collected in numerical form that can be counted. That's easy to tabulate. All we have to do is count up all the yeses or nos, right? And then chart them to percentages, or all the responses to option A of a multiple choice as opposed to option B on a multiple choice survey. Questionnaires can ask more complex questions beyond the yes or no, right? We might ask individuals to check a box. We may provide a few opportunities for individuals to express their ideas, though those are very rare at times on surveys. We want to give them predetermined responses and the opportunity to choose one of those predetermined responses. In most cases, the responses are subjective and they're going to vary from person to person. For example, how do you plan to use your college education? Well, we might give individuals an opportunity to free write briefly in a few sentences, or we might say, here are 5 or 6 options. Choose the one that best matches your plans post-college graduation. These types of questions require short essay responses, and participants who are willing to take the time to write those answers will convey personal information about their beliefs and values. Some topics that reflect internal thought are impossible to observe directly, and are difficult to discuss honestly in a public forum. People may feel more comfortable responding to a survey. They may feel more comfortable and give more honest and truthful responses, knowing that they're anonymous. When we think about open-ended questions, questions that allow participants to go in depth, to really share their true intimate thoughts about a topic, we can argue that that is a form of qualitative data. Qualitative data is exploratory research. The idea that we set parameters based on what questions we're going to ask, but we don't provide predetermined responses. We ask the question, it might be on a survey. We ask the question in an interview. We ask the question in a focus group, all of which we'll discuss in a little bit. And then we wait for the participant to respond. And they may respond in a few words, or they may respond in paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, or may go on for 15 minutes straight addressing a question. And we just listen and we take notes and we try to find opportunities to categorize their responses along with the responses of others who are participating in our study. Qualitative research, because there aren't any set responses, is more difficult to organize, is more difficult to tabulate, because we're going to have a wide array of responses, and a lot of those responses may surprise us at times. The benefit of written responses, the benefit of interview responses, is that it provides us a wealth of knowledge, of information, of data. So when we think about interviews as a form of qualitative research, it's a one-on-one conversation between the researcher and the participant. Interviews are similar to short answer questions on surveys in that the researcher asks participants a series of questions. And as we mentioned before, participants are able to answer any way they wish. In the back and forth conversation, a researcher can ask for clarification, they can spend more time on a subtopic, or they can ask additional questions. Typically, though, when we're conducting interviews, we want to make sure that all of our participants are being asked the same question. In an interview, and a participant will ideally feel free to open up and answer questions that are oftentimes complex. There's no right or wrong answers. And at times, the participant may not even know how to answer the question or answer the question honestly. That's why it's so important to develop a rapport, to develop the trust of those individuals that are participating in any study. The more comfortable people are, the more likely they are to open up to you. A researcher needs to avoid steering or prompting the subject to respond a specific way. Don't lead the individual towards a response that you find favorable to your study. This is not an interrogation. If you lead individuals, your data, your results can be considered unreliable. You want individuals to be honest with you. You don't want them to tell you what they think you want to hear. And at times that can be a tough pill to swallow, I guess you could say, for some researchers. Because we may assume that individuals have an opinion of a social situation. And then we find out, you know what? It really doesn't affect them. You know what? They really don't care too much about it. It doesn't have as large an impact as we initially thought. You look at field research, and sociologists seldomly study subjects in their own offices or laboratories. We go out into the social world. We meet subjects where they live, where they work, where they play. The term field research refers to gathering primary data from a natural environment without doing a lab experiment or a survey. It's a research method that's suited to the interpretive framework rather than the scientific method. To conduct field research, sociologists must be willing to step into new environments and observe, participate, and experience those worlds. In fieldwork, the sociologists, rather than the subjects, are the ones out of their element. We're observing people at times in their natural setting, which we'll go into more detail in a little bit. The researcher interacts and observes a person or people and gathers data along the way. The key point in field research is that it takes place in the participant's natural environment, whether it's a coffee shop or tribal village, a homeless shelter or the DMV, a hospital, an airport, a mall, or a beach resort. While field research often begins in a specific setting, the study's purpose is to observe specific behaviors in that setting. Fieldwork is optimal for observing how people behave. It is less useful, however, for understanding why people behave that way. Much of the data that's gathered in field research is not based on cause and effect, but on correlation. While field research looks for correlation, its small sample size does not allow for establishing a causal relationship between two variables. Because when you're observing people in their natural setting, you're only limited to who's in that setting, in that environment. And so it could be very difficult at times to generalize whatever findings because it could be specific only to the group that you're observing. We look at participant observations. And participant observations occurs when researchers join people and participate in a group's routine activities for the purpose of observing them within that context. It allows researchers to focus on a very specific aspect of social life. The researcher might go to great lengths to get a firsthand look into a trend, an institution, or a behavior. Researchers temporarily put themselves in the roles of the people that they're studying, and they record their observations. So a researcher might go work as a waitress in a diner. They may live as a homeless individual for several weeks. They might ride along with police officers as they patrol the regular beat. Often, researchers try to blend seamlessly with the population that they study. And they may or may not disclose their true identity because they don't want to compromise the results of their research. Participant observation is a useful tool if the researcher wants to explore a certain environment from the inside. Field researchers simply want to observe and learn. So that makes the distinction. Field researchers observe and learn. Participant observations, let's observe but learn from the inside. Let's be a member of this group, even for a short period of time. In such a setting, the researcher will be alert and open-minded to whatever happens, recording all observations accurately in what we call field notes, a notebook, right? Send text messages to themselves, update this information to a private web page, whatever it may be. And as patterns and behaviors emerge, questions will become more specific. And observations will lead to a hypothesis, and that hypothesis will guide the researcher in shaping his or her data into results. Some sociologists prefer not to alert people of their presence. And as we mentioned before, the advantage of covert participant observations is that it allows the researcher access to authentic and natural behaviors, of the group being studied. The challenge that we face doing a participant observation is, how do we gain access? Right? How do we not disrupt a group's behavior or an individual's behavior? It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. We have to develop a persona and pretend at times to be someone that we're not. We have to engage in role playing, we have to make contacts, we have to network, right? We might even have to apply for a job. It's a fairly labor-intensive and extensive process. Once we join a group, we spend months and even years pretending to be one of the individuals that we're observing. But we have to be mindful that we can't get too involved. We are a researcher, ultimately. We have to keep the purpose of the study in mind and apply this sociological perspective, this idea of a beginner's mind, going into new situations at a blank canvas, suspending any prejudices or biases we may hold. Now, the information that's gathered in a participant observation is largely qualitative rather than quantitative. So our results are very exploratory in nature, meaning that they're very descriptive or interpretive. Interpretive. The researcher might present findings in an article or a book and describe what he or she has witnessed and experienced without ever compromising the confidentiality and the privacy of individuals. So you make sure you don't include any identifiable details about the group or the individuals that you're studying. We look at ethnography, and that's the extended observation of the social perspective, and cultural values of an entire social setting. Ethnographies involve objective observation of an entire community. The heart of an ethnographic study focuses on how subjects view their own social standing and how they understand themselves in relation to a community. An ethnographer is committed to spending a determined amount of time studying every aspect of the chosen place and taking in as much as possible. We look at institutional ethnography, and this is an extension of basic ethnographic research that focuses intentionally on the everyday concrete social relationships of individuals. Institutional ethnography is considered a feminist-inspired approach to social analysis and primarily considers women's experiences within male-dominated societies and power structures. We look at case studies, and case studies are in-depth analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. To conduct a case study, a researcher examines existing sources, like documents or archival records, conducts interviews, engages in direct observation, and when possible, participant observation. Researchers might use this method to study a single case of a foster child, a drug lord, a cancer patient, a criminal, or a rape victim. Case studies are useful when the single case is unique in nature. One of the major criticisms of a case study is that a developed study of a single case, while offering depth on a topic, does not provide enough evidence to form a generalized conclusion. And that is why most sociologists do not use case studies as their primary research method. We look at secondary data analysis. And this is a result of not doing firsthand research, but looking at research that's already been completed by other researchers. So we studied the written works of historians, economists, teachers, or early sociologists. We're going to look through periodicals and newspapers and magazines from any period in history. We use whatever available information exists to save us time, but that will also provide us with an in-depth understanding of whatever it is that we're seeking to study. Sociologists often interpret findings in a new way, a way that was not part of the author's original purpose or intention. Social scientists also learn by analyzing the research of a variety of agencies. Governmental departments and global groups publish studies with findings that are useful to sociologists. It saves time, it saves money, it saves effort. One of the advantages of secondary data is that it's non-reactive research, meaning that it does not include direct contact with subjects and will not alter or influence people's behaviors. Unlike studies requiring direct contact with people, using previously published data doesn't require entering a population, doesn't require investment. It doesn't require any of the risks or bring about any of the risks inherent in the research process. But using available data does have its challenges. Public records may not always be accessible or easily accessible. Researchers have to spend time, invest time, trying to track down these databases, this data, and gain access to the records. To guide the search through a vast library of materials and avoid wasting time reading unrelated sources, sociologists employ what we call content analysis, applying a systematic approach to record and value information gleaned from secondary data as they relate to the study at hand. Unfortunately, in some cases, there's no way to verify the accuracy of existing data. Another problem arises when the data is unavailable in the exact form that we need, or may not necessarily include the precise angle that the researcher seeks. When we conduct content analysis, it's important to consider the date of publication of an existing source, and to take into account the attitudes and common cultural ideals that may have influenced the research, especially in that time period. Attitudes and cultural norms are vastly different from one era to the next. Beliefs about gender roles, race, education, and work have changed significantly. You want to keep that in mind. Look at ethical concerns. And we understand that knowledge can bring about significant and positive change. that we want to uncover new knowledge and we want to improve people's lives. But conducting a sociological study carries with it a tremendous amount of social responsibility. And as sociologists, we have an ethical obligation to avoid harming our subjects or groups that we're studying while conducting our research. The ASA, the American Sociological Association, is the major professional organization of sociologists in North America. The ASA maintains a code of ethics. And that code of ethics develops formal guidelines for how we conduct sociological research. What are the principles? What are the ethical standards that we need to be used in the discipline? It also describes the filing, the investigating, and the resolving of complaints of unethical behavior. As we mentioned before, researchers must obtain informed consent from participants and inform subjects of the responsibilities and risks of research that they agree to partake in. During studies, sociologists must ensure the safety of participants and immediately stop work if a subject becomes potentially endangered at any level. Researchers are required to protect the privacy of research participants whenever possible. Researchers are not ethically allowed to release confidential information, even if they are pressured by law enforcement authorities. Researchers must make results available to other researchers, must make public all sources of financial support, and must not accept funding from any organization that might cause a conflict of interest or seek to influence the research results for its own purposes. ASA's ethical considerations shape not only the study, but also how data is published. Lastly, and to conclude our lecture for today, researchers must establish value neutrality, a practice of remaining impartial without bias or judgment, and during the course of the study and the publishing of results. Sociologists are obligated to disclose research findings without omitting or distorting significant data. Thank you very much for your time.